Good morning. This is Pastor Mal Wagner from the Barrhead Church of God, and certainly we'd like to extend to you an invitation to attend a worship service with us here in Barrhead Sunday mornings at 10:30. We're not full bore on the services, but we are beginning to gather and to worship together, as limited as it might be. And thank you to those who have been faithful in coming. I trust that this weekend, a long weekend, the last one of the summer, is a blessed one, and that you are able to enjoy it. For many of the farmers, because the weather is holding, I'm sure they're busy getting preparation for combining, for harvest. And so pray for safety for them and for each one. It's one of the last Sundays that probably can be outside here, but looking forward to the fall as it comes upon us, and trusting that we get to celebrate many times together. Over the last number of weeks, we have been looking and studying the book of James as to his instructions for us, faith and good deeds, but also wisdom is an underlying theme in the book of James. Living wisely. We might think of wisdom as some knowledge aspect of it, but he brings about God's wisdom in saying that it is found in troubles and trials. In the beginning, the opening of the chapter 1. Count it joy, brothers and sisters, when troubles and trials come. We don't look forward to that, but they come. The Word, the living Word of Christ, is planted in us and is to be used like a mirror. That Word reflects back to us what we see of ourselves. So often we just want to take encouragement and keep going and not think about what God may be trying to say to us. But really the Word is there to reflect God's purpose in His calling upon our lives. Also, he talks about those good deeds that hold us accountable to being prejudiced, discriminatory, because the royal law is what guides our lives, the followers of Christ, the disciples of Christ. It's the royal law, the great commandments, if you will. And so from that he would say faith and deeds, good deeds go hand in hand. Both are there, faith and good deeds, and they work together to bring about God's blessings to other people. In fact, one of the ways that's most important is the tongue. And he talks about taming the untamable tongue. Well, that's impossible for us as humans to do, but by God's grace and His presence, it can be very much a conquerable event and circumstance. A thing, quality of character, that need not reflect unChristlikeness. God's wisdom also helps us to know God's ways in this world. And certainly we've come to know that in these days. The virus, the threat of the economy tanking, and many problems arising. But there's a basic difference between being a believer and a disciple. Michael Phillips says we can be both. We can be a believer and a disciple. However, it's possible to be only a believer and not a disciple. A disciple is one who learns of Christ, searches out the Scriptures to apply them to our life, that wisdom and faith are very much a part of our lives. Today, we want to look at a passage that pertains to the journey of faith, is a commitment to wisdom that lives God's way. James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. I'd like to read that for you from the New Living Translation. If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with humility that comes from wisdom. But if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, you will find disorder and evil of every kind. But the wisdom that is from above, it's kind of like James's list of the fruit of the Spirit. But the wisdom from above is first all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at times, at all times, he says, and willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. What's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Knowledge is the accumulation of facts and information. And today it is that day. Check anything. And how many times I've gone to Google something, find out what the definition is, or what is that about, some topic, some subject in the news that I don't understand. There it is, 25 words or less. Wisdom, however, is the correct application of knowledge to achieve a desired outcome. The application of knowledge to achieve a desired outcome. What's God's outcome for us? What's His hope? What's His dream? What's His belief? So today, that wisdom that is from above characterizes the disciple, not just the believer, but the disciple. James contrasts them here. He says, worldly wisdom will lead to bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, covering the truth, bragging, lying, creating disorder, being a source of evil, because it's focused on the person's world, on an earthly values, worldly values, and priorities. There's no place for God or little. And sometimes maybe we become impatient and give up on God because He isn't coming through fast enough. Last week I mentioned about Steve Malone talking about certain qualities and where they come from because of and how they're reflected in our speaking, in our tongue. And he said, a person with a harsh tongue has an angry heart. And how I've seen that from time to time, and even in myself, I'm sad to say, but glad to admit it, confess it, it's very real. A negative tongue, having a fearful heart. Yes, these days are fearful. Kids going back to school, wondering what's happening. All the changes that are thrust upon everyone, families included. What will the parents be able to do? Will they be able to go to work, or do they have to stay at home? An overactive tongue has an unsettled heart. Well, I remember the times when I'd run off at the mouth and just spewing out stuff just to, unsettled. Be at peace. Writer of Proverbs has something to say about that. You may want to check it out. A boasting or bragging tongue has an insecure heart. A filthy tongue, an impure heart. A critical tongue has a bitter heart. And when we look at the wisdom, see the worldly wisdom, what comes from those around us, and just our natural self, out of the selfishness, what we value most and over and above others. But James draws us back to that wisdom, his fruit of the Spirit, the actions, the attitudes that are present in the character of the follower of Christ, the disciple. He would say, and he gives to us, God's wisdom creates a pure heart, a peace-loving disciple, creates a gentleness, a yielding to others, the fullness of mercy, the fruit of good deeds, equality and justice, and he says no favoritism, equality, justice, fairness, respect for anybody and everybody. Not necessarily agreeing with them, but respecting them. Sincerity. Yes, we can be sincerely wrong. There's also a point at which sincerity is meaning the seeking of the truth, being honest and truthful, being a peacemaker that, excuse me, plants seeds of peace, not discord, but peace, reaping a harvest of righteousness, right relationships, building them, growing them, fostering them. Remember back at the very beginning of James in chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, he would say, if you need wisdom, if you need these qualities, these aspects of character of the disciple, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. And when you ask him, be sure your faith is in God alone. See, God is the source of that. It's a result of the fruit of who he is coming to live within us. James goes on here to say, living God's way, there's proof. There's proof that wisdom, God's way, is very much a part of a person's life. The person is living an honorable life, respected by all, respected by people who disagree and maybe even hate him, hate us, hate you. But there's an honorable life, doing good works with humility, recognizing that God can go beyond these efforts and multiply it as we seek to be a blessing to those around. The proof is the humility that comes from God's wisdom, God's way of doing things. Remember the things that he talked about. A pure heart. It's not built around selfishness and self-ambition, but around God's priorities and values. Peace-loving. Oh, sometimes we have to speak the truth, and it disturbs, it upsets things. There's no question. But there's a gentleness about it. Not a gentleness that walks away, pretends nothing is going on or that's wrong, but a gentleness that brings a strength and courage into that. A yielding to others who have making choices and making decisions that aren't in their best interest. Sincerity. Yes. Living God's way is a humble way. See, it doesn't depend upon us, but rather upon God. You see, the gospel of the good news is God is gracious. We don't need to prove ourselves. How much of the world is dependent upon that to succeed, to climb the ladder? I've got to prove myself. It's not saying we deny and negate and belittle the accomplishments we have. But we also know that we are of worth in God's sight, and that's what matters. What happens when we believe the lie that we need to prove ourselves to God, prove ourselves to others, maybe even prove to ourselves that we're worth something? What are some of the sinful behaviors and attitudes that result from that? Yes, pride, arrogance, running over people possibly, showing that we're better than anybody else. No. The loving person. Remember the Good Samaritan reaching down, crossing the road, and helping that individual that was beaten and robbed. How many people are beaten and robbed today of their dignity, of their worth? We come alongside to help and restore. See, another part of the good news is God is good. So we don't need to look elsewhere for our worth, for our needs to be met, and so on. When we believe, I'll let that plane go by. That's a neat part about being outside. You get to hear the living sounds of our world. Somebody probably enjoying a flight or maybe on an important journey. But God is good. What happens when we believe that the ultimate satisfaction is found in things other than God? What do we tend to turn to then? What are the negative consequences? When I believe that the ultimate satisfaction is found in things, I got to use them. Got to make them work for me. And when they break down, how easy it is to get angry and frustrated. What do we turn to when we lose our health? Remember some very wealthy people saying, I've got all kinds of money, but I can't buy any health. I can't buy my health back. It's destroyed. I've ruined it by my choices earlier in life. The negative consequences. Turning to things, making things more important than people. Broken relationships, marriages, homes. But the good news is, God is the one in source. God is great. That's the good news of the Scriptures. So we don't have to be in control. How many of us have found that in these days, these months, that we aren't in control? Oh, there's mandates and guidelines handed down to us from government, levels of government, about how we need to live and behave and restrict our behaviors and travels, and on it goes. You see, when we believe the lie that God is not in control and doesn't care about us, how do we respond? For me, it's an attitude of fight. I'm going to put a plan together that's going to succeed. I'm going to make this happen. It's going to work. It's going to happen, regardless how bad things are. No, we wear ourselves out. Worry, anxiety, frustration begins to set in. Another part of good news of Jesus coming, God is glorious. So we don't have to fear others. When we respect or fear other people's opinions more than God's, we follow the crowd and look like the rest of the culture or world. When we give in, instead of standing for the truth, standing for what's right, for justice and fairness and respect of all people, we're just not going along. What are some of the areas where our life is in line with the culture more than the Scriptures? I trust we'll take time to think about that as we reflect upon it. Back in January of 1986, January 28th specifically, NASA was planning to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger from the Space Kennedy Center in Florida. That mission included a school teacher named Krista McAuliffe. The launch had already been delayed a few times, and on the night before the new launch date, NASA held a long conference call with engineers from the contractor that built Challenger's solid rocket motors. Alan McDonald was one of the engineers. On that day of the launch, it was unusually cold in Florida, which concerned McDonald because he feared that his company's O-ring seals on the Challenger's big joints wouldn't operate properly at that temperature. The boosters had never been tested below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and McDonald recommended that the launch be postponed again. NASA officials overruled McDonald and requested that the responsible engineer sign off on the decision to launch. McDonald refused to sign, but his boss did. The next morning, McDonald and millions of people around the globe watched as a mere 73 seconds into the flight, the shuttle burst into flames and all the astronauts were killed. After the accident, a review showed the cause of the explosion to be what McDonald had feared. The O-rings failed to hold their seal in the cold temperature. Why then did NASA go ahead with the launch? Alan McDonald, the engineer that refused to sign, said NASA fell prey to the oldest and most basic sin, pride. He goes on to say, NASA had become too successful. They had gotten by for a quarter of a century and had never lost a single person going into space. What a feat, what an accomplishment. In fact, they'd even rescued the Apollo 13 crew halfway to the moon when part of that blew up. Seemed like it was an impossible task. But they did it. They rescued them. So how could this cold O-ring cause a problem when they had done so much over the past years to be so successful? He went on to say, all of that success gives you a little bit of arrogance you shouldn't have. It was an arrogance that ended in disaster. The NASA officials thought they knew better than the lowly engineers below them. They thought they were wise, but their so-called wisdom, born out of selfish ambition and pride, killed people and even crippled the space program for years. Where are you in your journey? See, there's a very real reason that James calls us to live with that wisdom that comes from God. A wisdom that doesn't depend upon one's ingenuity, creativity, ingenious schemes, and on, the pride, the arrogance to survive. But it's a wisdom that comes in living God's way. Let me read verses 17 and 18 again. The wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at all times, willing to yield to others. There's where the breakdown was, wasn't it? It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism. It is always sincere. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. God go with you on this Labor Day, remembering how hard it is to work, how hard it is to live in these days. But we are not without God's presence, without His peace and His ways. God bless you as you journey and experience God's blessings. Or should we say, the wisdom, that list of fruit of the Spirit, because it sustains us and brings us into that place of discipleship and not just being a believer. God bless you.